Hi there. My name is André. I've been working for a while using mainly GPU. Somehow I completely decided to just dump out the CPU work from the moment that I start seeing the benefits of using GPU rendering. But I didn't really start doing car production back then. I started with some more easygoing projects, mainly for motion and trying to squeeze the juice out of the GPUs to understand what was actually possible to do with it or not. And then I started understanding that you could actually do everything that it depends of the scale of the scene, right? But you could really output a lot of things using the GPUs. So one thing took to the other one, and I start working for big pixel mapping exhibitions because they demanded huge renders in a very, very short deadline. And outforming all of this will take a while, and you wanted to have the flexibility to change things on the flow. So this was definitely a benefit for the company to be able to just change things in one evening. If they wanted to just change the rims in a car, it would just change the rims, press render, and they will be rendered on the next day. So this was the last exhibition that we did in LA, and they came out with the idea of building a grid that you could use as a configurator for more than 26 cars, that they could just change the position. And the request that they wanted was to have lots of historical cars to kind of bring the idea of the evolution of the 911. And they wanted also to create moods with the cars. They wanted to assemble them with different light configurations if it would be possible. And they wanted to just light them up and just create this smarty look if they want to do that from one day to the other one. So, and this was quite challenging because since you only have like a few weeks to make production, probably like 2 months, you need to consider which things you shouldn't do and which things you should actually do. I decided to shift a little bit this presentation, not so focused into GPU, because I mean, I think the images, they will talk about themselves. You can see that you're able to output a lot of stuff on GPU. And I will focus more into what actually we had to produce using GPU. So as I told you, they requested kind of a grid configurator. And this grid configurator, it has to have like a front shot of the car. They had to get different car paint variations. I wonder why the quality is so terrible on the screen. I think it's the compression somehow. Okay. They wanted to have both front and rear. Second. They wanted to have both front and rear for every single car. And they wanted to be able to shift the car in any random position that they wanted to. This was one camera. So you were going to end up with 24 different light situations for each car on the cell. So if you start escalating this situation in order to finish the configurator, you will need to multiply by the number of 3 cells. For instance, in this camera, then you need to multiply this by the second camera that was the overall view of the grid. And then you sum up them, and you multiply this by 26 models. So these are completely different light setups for every single frame. I could drop them here, but probably we wouldn't leave it on time to have lunch. So this was a lot of information that we had to output using GPU back then. And as I said, I was not going to really talk that much about the GPU, but mainly show what GPU was able to output or not. But thanks God, Chaos dropped Cryptomate on GPU, and this was such a time saver. Don't have to roto anything out. You will able to see a problem on the car, just Cryptomate out the mask and just color correct it on like 6,864 complete different random variations. And you will be able to do whatever you wanted in After Effects with those 6,864 images. So, as again, with a rough deadline, I would like to focus more on the 7 things that I wish I would know from the beginning when I started working on GPU. And I think that the first one will be, I don't know if anybody here had the pleasure to just open a CAD file. The CAD files, they are extremely heavy. They are literally like porno for people that jump in the first time into the car industry, because you have all the detail in the car. You know, when you start doing car rendering, you kind of download these models from the internet that they're like poly-based in quads, and you have nice tessellation, nice detail. But CAD files are another level. They're just accurate data. It's the replica of the car you get straight from the manufacturer almost. So, and the first thing that I will talk about is really that data optimization. And if you bring a mesh that it's like 20 million poly, it's not a really big deal. It's not like, oh, 20 million poly, of course you can bring, but in this mesh of 20 million poly, you can cut out all of this. They just deliver you the entire model. It's just, okay, take it. You know, you just have to do this monkey job and be patient, that you can just select some of this geometry, just clean it up, and you will have way faster compiling times for frame after frame. And talking about one frame would never be an issue. I mean, if they would provide me this information to render one frame, I wouldn't do that on the first place. But if you have a lot of frames, at the end of the day, this will make a massive, this will have a massive impact on the render times. So you can just clean it up 11 million just out of that, just by having this monkey job of selecting stuff that you don't need. But there's tools to help you with that. There's like one script used by Max, probably other softwares, they have scripts. It's not really about the name of the script, but it's how you are meant to do things. And one way that you can really use this tool, it's just to select objects by size, you know, just by telling I want to grab everything in the viewport that it's lower than 4 units on the screen. It just selected 893 objects. And just because of screws or like the buttons on inside of the car. And that's like one of the first steps that I always do. By doing that, I just get rid of 893 objects on the scene that you won't even be able to see it, because you don't want to do a car interior render on the first place. But I don't really delete them. I just keep in a layer as a backup plan. And whenever I want to bring them back, I just unhide the layer and just they're over there. This would be like the first step to really squeeze the juice out of the GPUs if you want to take them into a situation that you want to drop like 8 cars and you feel like, oh, VRAM, I cannot really fit. You can. You just need to clean it up a little bit. And just by doing this also means that you will have, as I said, again, faster compilation times of the scenes. And if you're rendering and if you need to reopen scene after scene and press render, you will also have faster opening times for Max. And this is just a short board comparing like the file size that you get at the end, but it's the same exact look. Unless, of course, you always need to fill up the gaps. I mean, if you clean a lot of information, probably you will see through the geometry, so you need to fill it up that with geometry. So this will be like the first thing that I would have done back then when I got my first CAD files, and I didn't know that you were supposed to do that somehow. And then, you know, you keep going with the things. You always try, okay, how can I make this render faster? You know, there's always ways to optimize every single scene. And there's things that sometimes people don't even consider to do that. But it's just a few clicks, and if you have a sequence, you can cut a lot on render times, such as this shot. I don't need anything else on the scene. I just need to focus on that. So you just clean a little bit of the geometry, and you have like minus 85% of the geometry. The compiling times, frame after frame, they are insanely fast, and it's still CAD files. So you can always take the scene into an extreme optimization level, and by doing that, you know that you're going to render on time. And this one is not really meant to be a optimization of rendering or not. This always reminds me the first time that I rendered a car. It was quite embarrassing because, as I said, it was the first time that I got a CAD file. And when you open up a CAD file, this is what you should imagine. You always should imagine like a car standing in a platform where you don't have any physics over the car. You know, you still need to play around with suspension, with the wheels canvas, but you're always afraid of touching geometry that are being provided to you on the first place. You know, you don't know that you're meant to just play a little bit with the overall shape of the car. So my first render, it was like a 911 that almost looked like a SUV, and nobody really could understand why. So they were asking me to play around with the camera. Oh, make the camera lower. Oh, it still looks huge. Oh, make the camera taller. Oh, now it looks too fat. No, and then I understood that the problem was from the beginning that I didn't consider to play around a little bit with the geometry in order to fit it on the scene. Of course, this I did from the first place, like to line it up the wheels on the floor. And the second step would be to use the canvas, tilt a little bit the wheels, and the third step would just play around a little bit with the body weight of the car. And I always like to tilt the car a little bit to the front, so I think the overall statics looks better because the front shots, the car looks like the nose is facing the floor, so it looks more aggressive, and the back shots looks the other way around, looks like the car, it's more bulky from the back. So, and I was not doing this from the beginning, and I wish I would have done, and I didn't have this kind of feedback why the car looks so tall. That would be like the second step. Yeah, and this is like before and after, and I didn't know this back then. And the third one, and I had several situations that I had to render like 15K renders, and I was not considering to check my UVs before. And what happened when you just like shade a car on a 2K screen or even a 4K screen, if you actually look at this render, you're not able to check in detail all the plastic, if all the bump is up to scale. If you use triple NR, of course you don't have this problem, but sometimes you're not able to use triple NR on everything. So after I get my data, even before I start shading, even before I start creating cameras or start playing with it, I really try to check what do I have in that model. So I always jump into checking my UVs. This doesn't matter if it's Max, if it's cinema, you will always end up in situations that you just press render, it's like a 60K render, and at the end you start zooming in and you see like the bump on the plastic with different scales and so on, and this will force you to reopen the same data. It will force you to just check the voxel density to make it up to scale again and just render. And for instance, if you would do an interior render, this wouldn't be an issue because, I mean, this is like part of the steering wheel, so you will be able already to check everything up to scale. You can understand immediately if there's difference in the density or not. But the first thing that I would do would just unwrap the object immediately and then just play around with the texel density and make everything up to scale before I even consider to start rendering. Because probably you will need to reopen the file and render again if you don't check that on the first place. And once again, probably there's other scripts for cinema or for anything that will be able to do that. It's a pity that you're not able to actually read the names of the scripts, but this one here, it's fixed utilities, and it allows you to select every single object on your scene that doesn't have any UV assembled to it, and you just isolate it. And afterwards, you just unwrap it, super quick and dirty with advanced normalizer. And then what it does, it just checks all the textile density, and it just plays around with it and drop everything on the same scale. So you make sure that once you render this in 60K, everything will look nice, clean, uniform, and there won't be any surprises once you start zooming in your render. That's time to start shading. You know, you made sure that your data it's the way you want to. You feel okay. I'm like, oh, I don't want to look like a perfectionist guy to make sure that everything is the right way, but it should be, because there will be situations that you will feel like, oh, I wish I could have checked that on the first place, and you didn't. And somehow it's like a monkey job that if you do it, it's good for you. And then you jump into the shading process. And during the shading process, with time I start becoming more and more lazy. And by meaning lazy, it's like there's a lot of people that they check the cars and they feel like, oh, there's like brushed metal over here, brushed alloy over there, and they assemble a different texture to one, a different map to one. and then you go into the other metal, and you know that that metal, like it's a tiny bit brighter than the other one, but it's only you that can actually check this. You know, nobody will look at the render and will understand that this metal is a tiny bit brighter than the other one. So what I normally do, I just grab everything that it's about the same, the same tone. I grab everything that it's about the same material. If it's plastic, if it's TH702, if it's TH902, nobody will look at it and nobody will step close and check, oh, but this is this is the wrong plastic. Unless if you're doing car interior that they're really picky with material, but if you're just rendering cars for LEDs, nobody really step into this let's go picky about the material. So I always try to optimize the scene so I could end up with the less shaders as possible. Why? Because the less you have, the faster you will shade a car. And if you have like 24 cars to shade in a row, you really want to try to optimize that in a system that will allow you to build stuff like this. I always have a scene that I keep updating if I like for instance, the V-Ray next came out with the metalness recently, and of course I decided to play around it a little bit, and I could understand that the overall they looked better, and it was easy to play around with the settings. So I just updated all the metals that I had on my scene, and these scenes, they contain normally the names of the shared shaders that all the scenes they have. And I just used the scene for something that I called Oneclick shading. That it's like you bring your data, you have everything done, you just trigger the active shade, and then I just try to bring that scene into every single car that I have, and I just want to bring those pieces of geometry, and I just overwrite every single object on the scene. And of course, by coincidence, I had the blue tone of this car paint, but you can just change on the fly. So by doing this, you already have the car quick and dirty shaded. Of course, you always check for small imperfections on the tire mapping or the discs if they don't really match with the UV's projections. I will say that if you go through this process in a straightforward way, it doesn't take you longer than 1.5 hours to really clean the mesh, check the UVs, bring it in everything together. So you really made sure that in this order of the process, you will always make sure that you don't get any surprises at the end. So, and I from the beginning, I was not doing this. I was really jumping into every single car and checking, oh, nice chrome, and I was shading manually. That it's also nice somehow because of the learning curve. You need to be able to shade in order to evolve as in the sense of knowing how to shade a car. But by now, no, not anymore. I have my scene. I just drag and drop the materials over there every time I want to update them, and I just do that with every single file that I get. I don't shade anymore manually the same way I was doing it before. Another thing, it's mainly regarding let's go wild with perfection, and you're the only person that actually knows what's behind those spheres, what's assembled. So we have two spheres here. Through the resolution of the screen, you're not really able to see the textures and the patterns that are assembled to them. But I would say that one is a scan and the other one is procedural. And of course, the scan, it's extremely high detail, and the other one is procedural. And I'm going to ask you to which one of you will just trigger a number and tell me which one is a scan and which one is not the scan. That you don't understand them because it's not close enough to see the detail. I don't even understand from here because I really try to replicate them according to the scale. And I use scans very often, and sometimes I don't use them when I feel that I shouldn't use them on the first place. Because if the car is not close enough to really understand the bump and the overall quality of the scan, you don't need to bring all this extra information to the scene, because this will slow down the compiling times of the render. So what I do is I always try to get my textures organized this way. So I always try to plug a scan, and I try to plug a procedural way of doing things that they look the same, but they're not the same. It depends on what you want to do with that later. So I have the multimate assembled to an object, and according to the camera distance, I just swipe from one to the other one. If the camera gets close enough to the car, I just shift to the scan. If the camera is far away from the car, I just shift back to the procedural way. And once again, this has a huge impact on render times if you have to render full sequences over time. And of course, I was not doing this from the beginning. You always think like, oh, scans are beautiful. They're awesome. I mean, everybody knows that I'm a huge addicted to shade with scans. And I did on the beginning. I was using exclusively scans, but then slowly you start understanding that you need to understand when you're meant to use them. I use them all the time, but sometimes I trigger from one to the other one because you don't really see the difference in quality according to the camera. But then here you have, my friends, you have the scan over here and you have my procedural texture. If you zoom out, like as you saw before, you don't really see the difference in none of them. And here on my laptop, I mean, this is a full HD presentation. This screen resolution probably is way smaller than that, but you can actually see the bump. And the idea is really to try to match the glossiness level, the bump level into the scale of the screen. But then when you shift into a close-up, you just swipe back again to ID material number 2, and you just use the scan. So just by doing that means that you don't really need to consider to drag and drop a scan. Just because your camera went closer, you just change the geometry from ID1 to ID2. At the beginning, when you start rendering cars, you always need to somehow learn a little bit how to light it up the cars. And this is probably the worst part, because a lot of people, they use spotlights, you know, and they always trigger lots of specular and glossiness over the car. But some situations, you want to drop the car in a specific environment and have beautiful reflections over the car. And I always try to bring a little bit of that. And I always start by like creating my light setup. And I just brought here the AGR Light Studio screen, so you would understand a little bit how I try to process the way I do things. So the way I try to always get the shape of the car, it's by always finding what's the right spot. And by doing that, the first thing I do, it's like I exclude the architecture. I want to keep the architecture in a different layer so you can have more control afterwards. I want to focus first on the car, and then I'm gonna go to the architecture afterwards. And then once I isolate the architecture, I just find where do I want to have my light, and I work with masks and not with lights. So I try to find where I want to get my reflections on and not where the light is gonna hit the car. And then I do that afterwards by exporting this car, exporting the mask, sorry. I export this mask and I will use as a mask for any AGRI map that you want to. So if you change the car into a different architectural background, you can always keep the consistency on the light situation by just shifting the AGRI map and not creating a new light situation just because you change the architecture. So I always try to do that because it's simpler, it's easier, and you have more control over how you want to light it up the car. Because if I will need to just get AGRI map that will just cast like light on this direction would mean that I will need to reopen everything again. I will need to change the map. So I did that a lot of times internally inside of Max. So I had so many masks exported from AGR Light Studio back then that I was not even opening AGR Light Studio anymore. And by coincidence, last year Mark was here from Lightmap, and we were talking a little bit about how I like to process this way of doing things. And of course, afterwards, I just lighted up the architecture with a different light source that kind of goes with the same flow, but you can control intensity and so on. 1 year ago, this is quite interesting because Mark was here and we were talking a little bit. He came to me and he said, what do you think that you could change in HDR Light Studio? And I told him, I really miss a mask system that you can just folder everything inside and just mask it out everything without being able to shift content inside of the mask and keeping the mask always on the same position. Because that's what I'm doing here, you know, like that's the mask and that's the HDRI. So I can just swipe the entire light and keep the mask on the same spot. So, and Mark came out 1 year later with HDR Light Studio called Tungsten, and it's like a huge, massive update because it really changes the game. It came out with the feature called Composite. And just to exemplify a little bit here, I would like to show exactly the same light setup that I did, but I'm trying to do it inside of HDR Light Studio. And again, like I try to get the mask, and I'm using this mask just for the car, try to find like the right spot to pop up the shape of the car, and then I get another spotlight just for the architecture. I like to split things, even because of that. Because if I will use like a dome light, you know, the architecture will have the same, will have like the same light spread all over the place because it's a dome light. They don't have a 3D space on the scene. So I like to have these nuances of fall-offs around the car. So, and then I bring another light situation just as a backup plan because you don't want to keep the one side of the car completely black. And I do exactly the same way. You know, I get the right spot for the car on the opposite side. I drop the spotlight here, and then I combine them together. And at the end, you end up with this kind of light that you could think like, oh, this looks like a studio light, right? No, they are just masks, and they're just spotlights trying to understand where I want to keep my lights on. And as you may see here, I already have like 2 arrows here in these areas, so they are already composites. So it means that whatever content I drop inside, they will stay inside of this mask. So this is so comfortable. This really gives so much flexibility on finding a way how to do things quick and dirty, and they look good always on the first spot. So, and then, okay, you find your balance, okay, this is what I want, and it took me less than 10 minutes from trying to find this light setup into actually getting the light over the car. So, this is not for minutes. Okay, so this is literally this mask system, and I could find the right horizon line on the car, for instance, like on the back, I push the horizon a little bit taller. So, and on the front, I lowered a tiny bit, and this wouldn't be possible without using these 2 mask systems because they actually blend quite well. And this is so quick and dirty. I felt like, and Mark came in this year with this tungsten version with a composite, and I think it's a completely different workflow inside of HDR Light Studio. So, and yeah, that's the screen. That's with the composites. That's where I drop the light inside. And I think that if you want to just completely change the car from environment, you just go inside of the composites and change the HDR light maps, and that's it. I think it's the right way to do things somehow, because HDR maps, they're always awesome, but they bring complications sometimes, like, oh, that spot over there, you know, like, oh, I really like the reflection on this car, but that spot over there in the mirror, I wish I could just take that off. Yeah, just mask it out. So you're able to do that with now. Okay, next would be like render, because everybody's always so, when you start doing things, you always want to make sure that you get your render completely clean, and you don't need. It all depends about where you're going to publish it, and how you're going to do it. So I like to use this equation almost, that according to the speed of motion, you can have more blur and drop less samples, and you always will find out a way to that nobody really understands how many samples did you use on the screen. So if I have motion, you know, I can leave a lot of noise because anyway, the motion blur at the end will just clean it up everything. You won't even see it. And if you have a static frame, yes, you really want to make sure that you clean all the noise. And these are my standard settings that I use all the time. So whenever I'm running a static frame, I always go into 003. I like really to clean everything if you have time. And if I have motion, I just crank it up and just let it render with noise because motion blur will clean everything at the end. So, and at the beginning, I was actually rendering animation with clean. It was completely clean. I never considered that the noise was a problem. So, and Thomas from the party, he was one of these crazy dudes that he even takes noise to another level. Sometimes you check the beauty and you feel like, what? And then the MP3s, they look clean. So that would be like one of the things that I would have known from the beginning. And last but not least, and this is quite embarrassing somehow, you know, when you don't really get in touch so much with people, if I would come, like last year I came, you know, and I had the pleasure to see a presentation of people that were rendering. Thomas, he was rendering, and he was using a render management tool to do that. And I was not doing it. I was just rendering manually. I was falling asleep with my laptop in front of my face with this window. So I was actually checking renders all the time to make sure that they were going to render until the last frame. Until I just decided, no, you need to lose time. You need to find a way to just trigger out all the renders that you need, because if you have like 20 different passes to render, you don't want to do them manually. You want to optimize this way to make it as fast as possible without taking you any comfort out of your life. So I don't use a laptop anymore. I use Deadline. And anybody here that is rendering a lot of stuff, and if you don't use a render manager, please use a render manager. It was the best thing that I did since 1 year ago. I was just opening mock scenes and press render manually. Sometimes the frame was crashing and I had to reopen the same file and say I want to keep rendering from the frame 2015 or whatever, and I will still keep going with this until I start using Deadline. And last but not least, there's like a lot of compositing tools out there, but I'm really a big fan of a render node based Nuke because it allows you to script things out. And as we were talking, I had like 6,482 images to render out, and I tried to optimize this as much as possible by creating a script that you will just shuffle in every single car on top, that you will color correct it every single pass if you want it by going to the root of the tree and just grading stuff that you will see, okay, I need to grade this over there, I need to grade that over there. And then once I will have everything assembled, I would just I will just shuffle out every single image into a write node, token-based node, and this will render the 6,482 frames over the night. And if I will feel like, okay, I need to still color correct this, color correct over there, I will just do my minor tweaks and just press render again. And if I would have done that manually, I would never be able to output that much information in such a short time. And I hope that you are able to actually read the name of the script that I was using over the presentation, in case if you want to go home and still Google a little bit about it, because even if you work with Cinema or with Maya, probably you will find tools that they can actually do the same. And that's it. Thank you very much for dropping by.